I sit in front of my laptop all day, practically begging my brain to work, and nothing happens. The screen is open. The task is simple. You know exactly what needs to be done. But the moment you try to begin, something strange happens. Your mind stalls. Thoughts move slowly. Focus slips away. Even starting feels impossibly heavy. So you sit there. Minutes pass, then an hour, and eventually you reach for your phone, not because you want to scroll, but because your brain simply refuses to engage. This didn't used to happen. You used to handle pressure, deadlines, responsibility. You were the person who could push through. Now, something inside your mind refuses to cooperate. Simple tasks feel impossible. Your motivation has vanished. Your brain feels fried. And the most confusing part is this: you still care. You still want to work, but your brain won't let you. So the question begins to form in the background. Did chronic stress permanently break something in my brain? Because when chronic stress lasts long enough, the brain quietly begins to reallocate energy. And one of the first systems to shut down is the one responsible for motivation. Which means what you're experiencing may not be laziness at all. It may be something far stranger. Your nervous system may have switched into a survival state. And when that happens, the brain doesn't prioritize ambition anymore. It prioritizes survival. Which is why the real question isn't, why am I so lazy? The real question is, what exactly did chronic stress do to my brain? And once you understand that mechanism, the shutdown suddenly begins to make sense. To understand this shutdown, we need to start with an experience many people quietly recognize. You wake up already tired. Not just physically tired, mentally drained before the day even begins. Even simple tasks feel strangely impossible. You open your laptop intending to work, but your brain feels completely fried. The moment you try to focus, something inside you shuts down. Thoughts slow down. Attention slips away. And the harder you try to force yourself to work, the more your brain seems to resist. So you sit there. Minutes pass, then hours. Sometimes you pretend you're working, but in reality, your mind is stuck. Many people describe the same strange pattern. They say things like, "My brain shuts down when I try to focus. Thinking about work makes me physically tired. I only have energy for basic survival." Eventually, the brain looks for the easiest possible escape. Endless scrolling, mindless videos, anything that numbs the pressure building in the background. Not because these things are exciting, but because they require almost no effort. And this is where the experience becomes deeply confusing, because many people in this state remember being extremely capable, highly motivated, disciplined. The person who used to solve problems quickly and handle pressure without hesitation. Now that same person feels distant, like a previous version of yourself that you can no longer access. And that creates a disturbing question in the back of your mind. I used to be a high achiever, so why does my brain refuse to work now? That question is where the real mystery begins, because the answer has very little to do with motivation and almost everything to do with how the brain responds to prolonged stress. That question leads to a disturbing possibility. If you used to be capable, disciplined, and focused, why does your brain now refuse to cooperate? Why does motivation feel like it completely disappeared? Most people arrive at the same explanation. They assume something inside them broke. Maybe their discipline collapsed. Maybe their ambition faded. Maybe they simply became lazy. But that explanation immediately runs into a problem, because laziness doesn't usually feel like total neurological resistance. People describe something much stranger. You sit down to work. You know the task is important. Deadlines still exist, and yet your brain refuses to engage. You might even feel anxious about not starting, but even that pressure doesn't activate action. Instead, the mind becomes foggy, heavy, slow, almost like the brain is blocking effort. And eventually, people begin asking a much deeper question. Did chronic stress permanently damage my brain? Because the change feels structural. The same person who once handled pressure effortlessly now struggles to answer emails. Projects that once felt simple now feel overwhelming. This creates a powerful identity conflict. You remember exactly who you used to be, but the brain operating today feels like it belongs to someone else. And that leads to the real question. If motivation didn't disappear because of laziness, what exactly changed inside the brain? Because something did change. Not your character, not your ambition, your nervous system. And when chronic stress lasts long enough, the nervous system can shift into a survival mode, where motivation is no longer the brain's priority. Which means the shutdown you're experiencing may not be a failure of discipline. It may be the brain trying to protect itself. To understand what changed, we need to shift how the problem is interpreted. Most people assume the issue is psychological, a loss of discipline, a collapse of ambition. But research into chronic stress suggests something very different. The brain is not failing, the brain is reorganizing its priorities. When stress persists for long periods, the nervous system begins operating under a different set of biological rules. Instead of optimizing for productivity and long-term goals, the brain begins optimizing for survival and energy conservation. This shift is subtle at first, but over months or years of continuous pressure, the brain gradually reallocates its resources. Systems responsible for threat detection become more active, energy-intensive systems become more restricted, and one of the most energy-demanding systems in the brain is the one responsible for effort and goal-directed action. The network centered around the prefrontal cortex. This region allows you to plan, focus, make decisions, and initiate difficult tasks. But under prolonged stress, the brain begins limiting activity in this network. Brain imaging studies show that chronic stress can reduce activity in areas responsible for executive function, not because those regions are damaged, but because the nervous system is attempting to conserve metabolic energy. From the brain's perspective, this strategy makes sense. If the environment feels unstable or overwhelming, conserving resources increases survival probability. The problem is that modern stress rarely looks like physical danger. Instead, it appears as deadlines, financial pressure, relationship conflict, long periods of psychological strain. So the brain quietly enters a protective mode. and one of the first visible symptoms appears exactly the way many people describe it. My motivation completely disappeared. But motivation didn't vanish randomly. A specific brain system has been quietly altered, a system that determines something fundamental: your brain's willingness to initiate effort. To understand why motivation collapses after prolonged stress, we need to examine the brain system responsible for initiating effort. At the center of this system is the dopamine motivation circuit. This network links deep motivational structures of the brain with the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for planning, focus, and decision-making. Together, these systems answer a very simple question for the brain: is this task worth the energy required to do it? Dopamine is often misunderstood as a pleasure chemical. In reality, its primary role is much more practical. Dopamine regulates effort allocation. It helps the brain decide when something deserves energy and attention. When dopamine signaling is functioning normally, the brain predicts future reward. Effort feels meaningful. Starting a task feels possible. You see the task, your brain estimates the payoff, and the motivation system activates the energy required to begin. But chronic stress begins to interfere with this circuit. Research in neuroscience shows that prolonged stress can reduce dopamine signaling in motivation pathways. Over time, the brain becomes more conservative about when it releases effort, and that creates a very strange internal experience. Tasks that once felt neutral suddenly feel biologically expensive. Writing an email, starting a project, even organizing small responsibilities. Your brain evaluates the effort and quietly decides the energy cost is too high, so the motivation signal never fully activates. From the outside, this looks like procrastination, but inside the brain, something very different is happening. The effort system has been dialed down, and when that system becomes suppressed, the brain begins favoring activities that require almost no energy. Scrolling, passive entertainment, anything that avoids effort expenditure. Which explains why someone can still spend hours on their phone while feeling completely unable to start a simple task. The brain is not refusing to work. It is protecting its remaining energy. Once this dopamine system begins to slow down, another biological layer enters the picture. To understand that layer, we need to look at how the body communicates stress to the brain. During stressful situations, the body releases stress hormones. One of the most influential of these hormones is cortisol. In short bursts, cortisol is extremely useful. It mobilizes energy, sharpens attention, prepares the body to respond to threats. But the human stress system was designed for short-term danger, not months or years of continuous pressure. When stress becomes chronic, cortisol exposure becomes chronic as well. And over time, elevated cortisol begins altering how the brain regulates energy. Research on long-term stress physiology shows that persistent cortisol can interfere with dopamine signaling in the brain's motivation pathways. The system becomes less responsive, reward prediction becomes weaker, effort begins to feel more expensive. But the most important shift happens at the level of the nervous system itself. When the brain detects prolonged instability, it stops prioritizing growth ambition and productivity. Instead, the nervous system begins prioritizing survival and energy conservation. From a biological perspective, this strategy makes sense. In unstable environments, organisms reduce unnecessary energy expenditure. The brain begins filtering out activities that require sustained cognitive effort. Planning, problem-solving, complex decision-making. Not because those tasks are impossible, but because the nervous system is trying to prevent additional strain. And that produces a very specific internal experience. Mental fatigue appears quickly. Focus becomes difficult to sustain. Tasks that once felt normal suddenly feel exhausting. This is why many people say something that sounds strangely physical. Thinking about work makes me tired. Under chronic stress conditions, that statement is surprisingly accurate, because the brain is quietly trying to limit how much energy it spends, and the motivation system is one of the first systems placed under restriction. When you look at this system from the inside, many confusing experiences start to make sense. The brain is not refusing effort randomly. It is responding to altered motivation signaling. The dopamine circuit that normally initiates action is operating at reduced capacity. That is why even simple tasks can suddenly feel impossible. The problem is not intelligence. It is not discipline. It is not a lack of ambition. It is a brain that has become extremely conservative about spending energy. So when you open your laptop and try to begin work, the effort signal never fully activates. You sit there waiting for momentum that never arrives. Your brain feels completely fried, and eventually your attention drifts toward activities that require almost no cognitive effort. Scrolling, passive content, anything that avoids sustained planning. Brain imaging studies show this exact pattern under prolonged stress conditions. High-effort executive networks reduce activity. Low-effort habit systems become more dominant. This is why many people say something that feels deeply unsettling. I feel disconnected from the person I used to be. The capable version of you still exists, but the biological systems that normally unlock effort are currently restricted. Your nervous system is prioritizing survival efficiency instead of productivity. And when the brain operates under those rules, your own mind can begin to feel unfamiliar. But there is one important detail many people miss. These systems are not permanently broken. They are adaptive, which means the same nervous system that reduced motivation under chronic stress can also restore it once the biological conditions begin to change.
Once this system is understood, the next question naturally appears. If chronic stress can suppress the brain's motivation circuit, does that system stay stuck this way? To answer that, we need to understand an important property of the nervous system. The brain is adaptive, not permanent. The same neural circuits that reduce effort signaling under stress can also gradually recalibrate when the environment begins to feel safer. But this recalibration rarely happens instantly, because the brain does not restore motivation simply because you decide to push harder. It restores motivation when the nervous system stops detecting constant threat. Under chronic stress conditions, the brain learned to conserve energy. Dopamine signaling was reduced to prevent unnecessary effort expenditure. So recovery involves a slow reversal of that protective state. Studies of stress physiology show that when cortisol exposure decreases over time, dopamine signaling in motivation pathways can begin stabilizing again. The brain slowly becomes more willing to allocate effort. But this process is gradual. At first, the changes are subtle. Small amounts of focus return. Short bursts of motivation appear. Tasks that once felt impossible begin to feel slightly less heavy. Not easy, but no longer completely blocked. From the brain's perspective, motivation is not something you force. It is something the nervous system permits when energy conditions improve. And that explains why recovery from chronic stress often feels slow, uneven, and biological. Because what you are rebuilding is not discipline. You are rebuilding a nervous system that finally feels safe enough to spend energy again. And when that shift happens, motivation does not need to be forced. It returns naturally.
When you look at the system this way, the experience stops looking like personal failure. The brain did not suddenly become lazy. It did not forget how to work. It adjusted its energy strategy under prolonged stress. The dopamine motivation circuit reduced effort signaling. Chronic cortisol exposure pushed the nervous system toward conservation, and the brain shifted into a state designed for endurance, not productivity. That is why so many people describe the same strange moment. You sit in front of your laptop. You know exactly what needs to be done, but your brain shuts down the moment you try to focus. Not because the task is impossible, but because the biological system responsible for initiating effort has been operating under restriction. And when that system begins stabilizing again, something subtle starts to change. Focus returns in short windows. Tasks begin to feel slightly less heavy. The brain slowly regains its willingness to spend energy. But this leads to a deeper question many people rarely consider. If chronic stress can suppress the brain's motivation system, what happens to the system responsible for decision-making? Because the same stress signals that reduce motivation also interfere with another critical brain region, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, judgment, and self-control. And when prolonged stress begins to suppress that system, something even stranger can happen. The brain may still be awake, but your ability to think clearly begins to disappear.